this film was born in the state of North Carolina, as it were, and that's because that's where you, Nancy, and you, Colin, first met. Can you explain how this relationship between the two of you started and what the mutual interest was in this story?
Can you do that?
I guess I can. I was underway with the documentary. I discovered Mildred's story by reading her obituary. And I was struck with the power of the story and the fact that I didn't know anything about Mildred and Richard Loving, and I felt like that was a huge oversight. I started working on the documentary. I met Colin's wife and told her about it. And she said, Colin would be really interested in this. It was just a couple of months later that he was shooting a film, Main Street, in Durham, North Carolina, and a festival that I used to run called the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival was taking place exactly at the same time. And so we all got together. And I started telling Colin about the story, and I think he was immediately taken with it. And I guess they say the rest is history, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was just completely blown away that such a gripping and important story seemed to be so unknown, and also that it was so unusual set against the background of that decade and everything that was going on in the civil rights movement. Actually, right on the doorstep, and once these two people were in Washington, they were a few blocks away from the marches and Martin Luther King's speech, and they had absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. And so in the conventional sense, they were not activists, and yet this commitment to each other proved to be so forceful, an example of how something so quiet can lead to something so immense. A lot more radical than it seems at first glance, because they did have choices. If they'd divorced each other, they probably could have gone back and led lives very much like the ones they'd been living before, but that was non-negotiable. And so there's so many of these elements I felt were a missing piece, a very important missing piece of the history of that time.
Jeff, you've made so many great films in the last number of years, like Take Shelter and Mud and Midnight Special. What made this one different in the fact that this is a movie that didn't come from your imagination? This, I think, is the first time that you've ever worked on a film, written a film that wasn't an original story. How did that change things for you?
It's interesting. The differences, though great, honestly don't feel that extreme when the work starts. In each of my films, I try and look for some emotional core, something that I feel that is palpable. The potential death of my son in Midnight Special, high school heartbreak in Mud, the end of the world in Take Shelter. These are things that I carry around with me, and I feel like if I can build at least one moment in the films that represents that it'll somehow transfer over to the audience. In this case, that scene exists, several of them, but it wasn't my story. It was Richard and Mildred's. But despite that fact, I still felt this palpable connection to it. I felt a palpable connection to Mildred's love of place, especially the South. That's something I can identify with greatly. I think I totally empathized with Richard's inability to take care of his family, despite the fact that that was the one thing he was capable of doing. These were emotions that, even to this day, when I watch them, they sting, and that's what I look for in a story. But in this particular instance, I think there was a great responsibility that came with it, a responsibility to not overemphasize or try to glorify something that wasn't there, because what was there was so beautiful and so sincere It really didn't need any polishing. I just had to be true to it, and it would do the heavy lifting.
I'm very excited to address a question to Joel and Ruth, just so I can hear you all gasp when you hear what the two of them actually sound like in comparison to how they sound in the movie. Is it harder to do less than it is to do more?
Well, you know, like to kind of roll on with what Jeff's saying and what's been spoken about already is that one of the great things about this movie, I think, is that Jeff chose, and these guys chose, to take a true story and then trust Jeff to make it. And his mantra seemed to be all the way along the line, not just to strive for accuracy on all fronts, but to tell a true story truthfully, which is actually, it sounds very simple, but it's very rare. We all watch movies in Hollywood and go, this is a true story with a bit of extra stuff to make it an experience in the cinema. But this story was enough. These people were enough. You fall in love with them. And in fact, it's better that you tell the story truthfully in order that you really, truly fall in love with them and experience what they experience and have an empathetic experience with them. Richard was a very... I think he was a very intuitive person, incredibly simple in a wonderfully human way, and not very vocal. But yet, when you watch Nancy's documentary and when you watch all of the extra archival footage that she provided to Jeff that couldn't go into the documentary, you see a man who is thinking a lot and saying very little, and in the mantra of telling that true story truthfully, Jeff stayed true to that. And it was definitely, in terms of my portrayal of him, it was my task to do that, and together, you know, the three of us, but in conversation, particularly with Jeff in regards to Richard, we're looking for the specificity of the silence, you know, the reasons for the silence, rather than just a man who's sort of switched off to what was going on around him. I think he had a very deeply emotional response to what was going on, deep levels of frustration, a constant search for the way out. And I think, unlike Mildred, who was looking forward and tiptoeing to look over the fence and look into the horizon of what was possible in the future, Richard seemed to be looking for a way out of the view of the camera on a micro level, on a macro level, a way out of the whole situation, and a wish to make everybody else but Mildred disappear.
I'm so struck by the scene where the police officers show up when you have your newborn in your hands, and the way that you play that is just utterly devastating in its subtlety. Was that a scene that was particularly exciting or challenging for you to do?
It was particularly heartbreaking because that happened, you know, and to think that a woman would have to do that in order to sort of maintain some sort of strange moment of peace. It's really extraordinary. But there were many moments throughout the civil rights struggle like that. I think that the thing is that Nancy's documentary, you know, which features archival footage of this couple, was a real gift to us as actors. It's basically Nancy did all my homework for me. Thanks, Nancy. No, see, it was a beautiful portrait of this couple, a study in this couple, and it was really invaluable for us, you know, from a physical, practical point of view, from an outside-in point of view, you know, the way they moved, the way they talked, the way they spoke, and most importantly, the energy between them, which was really palpable and tangible and beautiful, and I think that's what captivated people when they see this couple on screen, and that was what that was our challenge, is to recreate that. But we felt very supported. It was one of the most collaborative experiences, you know, because there's a whole heap of us in it. Not to mention Mr. Kenneth Walker, who
Absolutely.
you know, there's nothing like seeing yourself transform into someone in front of a mirror that gives you confidence in your ability to play that person, you know, on a very basic, visual but super important level. And I truly credit Mr. Ken and Julia Alice and Aaron Minogue with that.
Kenneth, what was most helpful for you in coming up with the hairstyles? I would imagine the footage that Nancy unearthed for her documentary. And then I was thinking, was everything that exists of Richard and Mildred in black and white? Or was there any color photography, any color footage?
Basically, it was black and white, but Jeff was my leader of the pack. And Ruth and Mr. Joel, they had definite opinions about it. And Ruth's computer opened up every morning when we started a scene, and we would go over these hairstyles every day. And it was just a joy to come in there and have this piece of knowing that this woman knew what she had studied Mildred long before we even started working this show. Jeff, when he saw Joel's hair, it was like really dark. And Richard was a blonde, and we worked and we worked and we toned and we figured it out, and it worked so well after we discovered the formula that we needed. But just being on this show, because when I first got the call for this show, Sarah Green called me, and she was telling me about Loving. I said, you mean the Lovings in Richmond, Virginia? Because believe it or not, I lived around that time too. And I knew the story, and I was like, oh yeah, I got to do this. This is something I must do, because it's a piece of history. It's what's going on right now, the civil rights and everything that was going on. And growing up in Los Angeles, people would never believe that I went through some kind of horrendous things. And I got through that. But to be a part of this film and watch and figure out, not just for these two, but we had a whole cast that we had to work with and create a whole visual for that period. And the 50s was kind of my time. And then we went into the 60s, and it was just a joyous occasion. It was a collaborative thing. We had wardrobe, we had makeup, and we had Jeff who spoke his mind, and I followed the leader, you know, and it was good.
Well, I can't thank all of you enough for making this film and for being with us tonight.